Hey, good to see you. Thanks for coming. This is another episode of Wireframe brought to you by Design Systems House. I am your host, Donnie D'Amato, and today we're going to be talking about the very exciting topic of text alignment. I promise. There'll be some interesting things in here for sure. But before we get into the topic, I want to talk about some things, just updates, just in general. Thanks for everybody who has joined the Discord so far from the last episode that was talking about Discord related stuff. I just realized the camera just changed for some reason. Whatever. We're doing it live. And then another thing that is an update is that I have a new blog post that came out earlier today called Complementary Space. If that sounds familiar to you, you probably know Complementary Space from the site that I made 2.5 years ago, which was called complementary.space. And the reason why there's a new blog post that is talking about complementary space is because I'm looking to sunset that domain that I purchased for that project. Admittedly, complementary space is a very niche kind of thing. And while it was fun to make these like microsites that people have said they enjoyed, admittedly, it is costly to have a single thing on a single domain. So I think with the introduction of mise-en mode, which encompasses the idea of complementary space within it. Plus, I actually realized in writing this new blog post that I actually have one of my earliest blog posts is called Spacing Solved, and I actually talk about what is effectively complementary space in there too. So now the blog is fully covered when it comes to space overall, and I could definitely start sunsetting the complementary space domain at some point soon. So if you are still looking for complementary space or referring to it or whatever, certainly take a look at the blog now so that you can get the latest in there. And in fact, if you're looking for that post, you can either go to my blog if you know it, or the Discord. It's totally on the Discord. Let's go ahead and just add that to the lower third there, right? Okay, go to the Discord. Yes, we know. Yeah. So. Let's see. The other updates we have here is that there's going to be an event in New York City that I'll be at Wednesday. It's a design leadership event. I would share it, but it's already sold out. So if you're going to be there, you're going to be there. If you're not going to be there, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to come because it's sold out. But I will be in the city on Wednesday for that, and actually completely not design related, just nerdy, geeky stuff related. If you don't know already, I'm a big Overcooked fan, specifically Overcooked 2 on the Switch. And I'm going to be in the city on Saturday playing with some friends, which I'm actually super excited about, especially since they made some updates to the game, which aren't playing so nice for online play. But playing in person is going to be great. So those are the updates. Now we're going to talk about text alignment. And to start, let's ask AI about what they think about text alignment, what things we should consider when speaking about text alignment on the web. Hey, so I'm wondering about text alignment. What kinds of things do I need to keep in mind when considering how I should align text on the web?
When considering text alignment on the web, there are a few key things to keep in mind: readability, consistency, and visual hierarchy. Firstly, ensure that your text is easy to read by using ample spacing between lines and avoiding justified text, which can be difficult to read. Secondly, maintain consistency by using a consistent alignment for similar elements like headlines and body text throughout your website. Lastly, use visual hierarchy to guide the reader's attention by varying the weights of different elements.
Okay. I think you increase the scope of what I'm asking a little bit, because I'm specifically thinking about things like left aligned, center aligned, right aligned, and of course justified text. What are the considerations that I should have in mind for choosing one of those kinds of alignment?
When choosing between left-aligned, center-aligned, right-aligned alignment, consider the purpose of the text and the desired effect on the reader, the available space and the overall layout of the page, the amount of content and how it aligns with other elements. Generally, left alignment is best for body text, and center alignment is often used for navigation links, titles, or subtitles.
Okay, that's a good start. That's a good start. Now, let's ask about right-aligned text. I mean, other than in a right to left language, are there areas where we expect to have right-aligned text?
Right-aligned text is not widely used and not often expected. It is considered to be unusual to use outside of specific situations such as logos, headlines, and some specific layouts such as in magazines or newspapers with sidebars or special sections. It's not a standard practice to use right-aligned text in body text.
Okay, we're actually going to challenge that a little bit today. But that's a nice little primer to start off with for our show. Speaking of our show, I actually want to see the comments, making sure that there's anybody in the chat that wants to chat over here. But ultimately, we're going to be talking about text alignment today. I want to talk about lots of different things that you would want to consider when it comes to text alignment. There's been some conversations that I've heard recently about, different kinds of reasons why you might do something over another. So I want to kind of disambiguate a whole bunch of that. And in order to do that, I'm just going to start off with a whole bunch of stuff that I know. And I'm going to show also a couple of sites that kind of also illustrate some of the points that I'm making. So the first thing that I think is super important is that everything that you build on the web should be focused on trying to left align. So basically, when in any sort of doubt, left align. And the big thing, and this is again talking about left to right languages, if there's another language that you're designing for, there might be a different kind of alignment that you need to have, okay? And additionally, as I speak about being left versus right aligned as an example, in the web, we have this idea of called logical properties that are actually meant to describe the direction of the writing or the reading. So if I say left align, what I really mean, especially in CSS, is something like start aligned, meaning that wherever the reader is meant to start reading, that's the alignment that you want. So for people who read in left to right, the left alignment starts at the left. For people who read right to left, start alignment is on the right. So for the purposes of us explaining this stuff, if I ever say left aligned, assume that I'm talking about left to right language and that, the left is the starting edge, okay? But generally speaking, again, everything on your site, you should just start with start align, okay? In fact, I actually don't know if the browsers have updated from a text align left to a text align start at this point, but it really should be marked as start right from the beginning of the page. Now, the next thing is the possibility of center aligned, right? I mean, even on the website for Wireframe, this is center aligned text in here, right? And it doesn't look bad, I guess subjectively speaking. It's, just has it's all center aligned, little angles to it or rotations to it to make it look interesting. But what I see often is lots of people who center align things that probably don't need to be center aligned. And the question, of course, ends up being, well, when do you know when to center align something or why it's good to center align versus not good to center align? So like I said, if your baseline is left aligning everything, then that's what your default is. That's what you go back to, right? That in terms of, if you have any doubts, just left align. But if there's something that's like, this feels like it could be center aligned, what you're looking out for is effectively the way that a person reads text. And in fact, I'll bring up this first post because I think the first post that I found does a really good job illustrating what I'm talking about. And there's this post here by Boonin UX, I think it is here. Yeah, Boonin UX. And the thing that I want to illustrate is this image right here. Let's bring this up on the computer. So you could see this image here where we have center aligned text, and it's saying right here in the image, when you center text, the reader must make additional eye movements on both sides of the content. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that as the person is reading from left to right, on this body of text, the eye needs to grab where the beginning of the text is to start reading the next line. Now, if that start of the next line always ends up in the same place, it's a lot easier to read because you're not scanning to figure out where the beginning of that line is. And it sounds a little interesting too, because it's like, wait, I'm not consciously trying to do that. Well, the answer is no, you're not. You're subconsciously trying to find where the start of the text is so you could start the thought, start the reading, and then move on to the end, right? So when you center align something, especially when you have several lines like this, it makes it really hard to get back to the starting edge again. You could almost think of it like an old school typewriter if people remember what those things were, right? You start typing, you get to the end of the line, and then when you hit the carriage return to hit to the next line, right? It goes to that left edge, right? So it knows exactly again where to start, typing again, just like any other word processor would. So when you center align stuff, just like with your eyes, the eyes are having a difficult time to figure out what the alignment's supposed to be, right? Just for the sake of it being centered. And I understand how much designers love centering things, but I think when it comes to actually reading content, right? And I'm talking about content like a nice chunk of content, a couple of lines of text. When that's a couple of lines of text, that's content that I'm trying to ingest and understand and get the gist of over several lines. That's more difficult to do than a single line, which was at like wireframe, right? Wireframe live is literally 2 words, very quick. There's not really much to grab from that, right? So that means it's a little bit more appropriate, right? And it's the same kind of thing when the AI was talking about buttons and links and navigational stuff, right? You only expect 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 words in those things. And in those things, we typically end up seeing them being center aligned inside of those elements because, again, they're not wrapping. We're not expecting the content in a button to wrap, or hopefully not. So that's something to be considering there, again, is the content that you're dealing with in there. Now, speaking of content, when we're looking at some of the examples that I put up in here as well, something that you need to pay attention to, and I say this all the time, is that the content that you put into your experiences isn't necessarily the content that the end user is going to see. Because that end user can translate that content into another language, okay? Now, of course, to make it easy to kind of think about this, is thinking about a language that is one, romance kind of language to another. So imagine some kind of like English to German, which is not romance, but you get the idea. But it's still left to right. It still uses our Latin alphabet, so having that one-to-one, just that alone can still increase the size of these words and potentially have them go onto separate lines, right? Because the more, word there is, the more possibility of it end up being on another line because of the amount of space. So even if you think that you're curating the words that are inside of this area, it might appear different just because of that, And in fact, speaking of this, I'm just thinking about it because I have an example of this on the blog since I talked about it earlier. My blog has an interesting kind of alignment scheme, and I'll put it up on the computer here. So here's the new blog post, complimentary space. But if you look at the titles, you'll see that there's a couple of different things that like alignment strategies almost, right? Because you could see that a couple of these things, like these brown ones specifically over here, they're left aligned, right? It's left aligned to this edge over here. But these green ones, they're center aligned, right? And you might be wondering, well, hold on a second, what's going on there, right? Because it looks like there's 2 different kinds of alignment. And the reality of what's actually happening here is that inside of the CSS, this is a flexbox alignment of centering, right? But the text align is actually left. So text align left is actually happening in here, or text align start is actually happening in here. But because the box itself is not as big as this box here, right? I'm saying that all the content in here is center aligned until it becomes too big. When it becomes too big, it becomes left aligned, okay? And that's how I'm making this behave to have different kinds of alignments depending on the content inside of the page. I didn't even realize I was doing that up until just now talking about it. I mean, I knew I was doing it then. I didn't realize how important it would be to talk about it now. So, but anyway, that's something that to pay attention to, right? Because you could technically do a similar kind of effect where, again, you flexbox the title container, right? So the title can do what it needs to do in there. When it's small, it ends up being centered, which is fine. But if it ends up being large, then you left a line, right? Now, the other thing that you want to also consider when it comes to aligning text, especially these kinds of things like headlines, is that if you are trying to show a relationship between the heading of a particular body of content and the body itself, then it's another really good case to actually left align, because that shows a relationship between these two things. And I'm thinking I probably have another example of that hanging around here somewhere. Let's see. I want to see. Yeah, this is actually a really good one. So this is another post from Garrett Digital, actually, and it's showing a Guardian article that has left aligned text, which, you know, looks pretty clean. And then you can see here's the center aligned text. Now, again, this is probably a little bit facetious. You know, I don't think many people would do this, other than potentially doing, you know, the center line here, right? But we could even see the comparison, especially with the leftovers here. I forget, is that a widow or an orphan, but I always get them freaked up. But you can see that the leftover here, just because it's on the left-hand side, feels a lot better than this dangly bit at the bottom over here when it's center aligned. And that's another thing, again, to pay attention to, especially, again, translating into languages, is that you might get that little dangly bit at the end when it's centered. That looks a little weird. You know, trying to manage widows and orphans and things like that in CSS is unfortunately non-trivial. It's actually a little bit of a challenge, even though we do have properties that are supposed to be managing those things. So, again, the idea here is again, trying to have your headlines much more related to the content, having that left aligned edge so that you could see the hierarchy and how things connect as you read is really great. Another thing that I wanted to point out about this as well is that from an accessibility standpoint, I worked with a person a long time ago when I was at Compass, and he had a vision impairment. So much so that the text on, he had two big screen monitors, but the text on either one of those screens, for something that was like, you know, regular size text, maybe like a 16 point or 18 point over there, the text on the screen would be this big, okay? And yeah, many people aren't expecting people's text to be this big, you know, banana for scale, I guess. But it was large, it was really large. And when a person is trying to read text like this, going back and forth, again, having that left edge always lined up, so they always know what to go back to, just like a typewriter would, is a lot easier than trying to find where the edge is, right? Where's the edge for the next line, right? You could go too far, you could not go far enough. So all of that makes it really hard for an accessibility, someone who's looking for, some help in the accessibility space to work with this. And in fact, I think there's, let's see, is there a note on that somewhere? I'm trying to look for it here. This is more, this is the heading one. Floated's good too, right? Because floating is a thing that does happen in like articles and stuff like that. Here's the images I'm looking at, and you could see the left edge here that's getting nice and straight, and then on the right side as well. I think based on what we were just talking about, it would make more sense for to not use this, because the edge does change, right? You're reading from the first 7 lines, it's on this edge, but then all of a sudden it goes all the way back here, right? In the right floated example, I think it's a little bit more preferable, because now you are traveling over and then already know where this edge is, right? That edge just hits right there. You know, this admittedly looks kind of like gnarly on this edge. I totally agree with that. But that's the reality of trying to manage text, right? That you get that ragged edge, unless you don't, right? So that goes into the justified text kind of idea. And what you'll see on the web all the time is recommendations of avoiding justified text. And the reason that usually happens is because the alternatives of actually adding that justification ends up making the text really difficult or distracting to read. So the two options you normally have when it comes to the web and justifying text is either that text is justified by adding spaces, larger spaces in between the words to make those words end up on both ends, or words are hyphenated in lots of places in order to keep the text looking like it's lined on both sides. And both of those things have significant drawbacks, right? The space that might be introduced for the text justification could include these things called rivers that are very distracting. It's all this white space that ends up in the middle of your body of text. So it ends up being a distracting thing as opposed to something that you're trying to read content. And then similarly, on the other side, for those hyphenations that will always appear on the right-hand side, some of these words might just be something that you trip up on when it gets hyphenated, right? Especially some kind of long word like statement, right? Started with the word state and then meant at the bottom. You would read the meant and then maybe you would forget that the meant was for state, as opposed to it being just one word, where you could get that entire sentence or one thought in one shot, right? Because that hyphenation breaks things up. It breaks up ideas and things of that nature. So when it's breaking up a word that it could effectively be two different ideas, the comprehension suffers a little bit. So that's why we usually avoid justified text. In print, it's a lot easier because there's a lot more control in print, right? Because again, content's not changing in print, the layout's not changing in print, right? So you can make a lot more fine-tuned decisions about where text starts and stops. In fact, actually, my wife was helping me with the back cover of the book, where we have a couple of testimonials of people who've actually read it already. And one of the things that she was doing was actually adjusting some of the space in between the letters to get things to fit better. And because it's going to be printed, like, that's completely reasonable. But for the web, we really don't have that level of control. We really need to provide more control to the user. So because of that, you get the ragged edge, but it's more important for that user to get the content than feel something about this ragged edge. But of course, if you can get the ragged edge to, behave, especially, in places that, that's a benefit, but it's not something that necessarily strive for, and especially as well as maybe a way of helping that a little bit is something that I have to work on, is using less large words, right? Because smaller words will break more frequently than a large word. So that'll probably help out with an edge potentially, but not all of the time that you could do that. Especially my blog posts, they always got these large words. I just want to see if there's anything else that I wanted to call out. Oh, there is actually a couple of things I definitely wanted to call out. So we heard from the AI about avoiding right-aligned text other than right-to-left languages, and that is mostly true except for very specific key spots. And it's actually mentioned here in this post here. So in this post here, you can see this bullet point right here that says right-aligned text for right-to-left languages, which we know, but it also says for data and numbers and tables and cards. Okay? So that's the caveat. And in fact, I tried to do a little bit of research about like more in-depth rules about when something should be right aligned versus any other kind of alignment. And this is true. Like when we see this in tables, we're looking at especially things like numbers in tables and even dates in tables, those things are right aligned. And I think certainly when it comes to many currencies, right, the thing that we're trying to align with being right aligned is the dollar amount, right? Those dollar amounts typically have 2 decimal places, right? And then some dollar amounts might be like, let's say $20, and other ones might be like, I don't know, $2,000. And what matters is the alignment to that right edge about seeing about how large this thing actually is. Granted, as in a quick glance, you could see that 2,000 is larger than 20, but maybe it's, I don't know, 19 and 22, right? And having those things right aligned, you can go ahead and make that comparison a little bit easier. There is another property in CSS called, font settings. It's a font settings, but it's the optical alignment, or tabular-nums. Sorry, tabular-nums is the value, I think. Let's make sure I got this right. I know it's, if you search for CSS tabular-nums, you'll get something. Tab, tabular numbers. There it is. Font variant numeric. Okay, so that's the one that we're talking about. Where is tabular-nums? Here we go. Okay. Did you select it? Are you selecting it? I can't even tell. Okay. Let's go to the computer for a second. So we're talking about font variant numeric here because what this does is it helps align numbers, which I wish these were right aligned, but as I change this, let's see if anything changes here. Not really, because everything's just kind of like in monospace, which I wasn't really expecting. But font variant numeric, maybe they have something better down here in terms of what this is doing. Let's see. No. Okay, fine. Let me go back to me. So font variant numeric is basically meant to align the numbers better than what would otherwise be for the font. So as an example, usually the number 1 is a lot thinner than the number 0, the number 8. And when you put those things on top of each other, you'll get different sizes of stuff because maybe you get a whole bunch of 1s and a whole bunch of 8s. You know, with 3 8s, that size of text is actually larger because the characters are larger than the 1s. What font variant numeric tabular-nums does, right, so tabular-nums, what that does is it makes all the spaces for the numbers be equidistant. It's effectively like a monospace kind of support for numbers. So that's something else in terms of like alignment that you should probably be paying attention to. And in fact, I would even consider putting that in almost in like the reset of your CSS just to make sure that the numbers are aligned. It might not be entirely accurate for other things that you're trying to like make more stylized numbers potentially, but it's certainly in tables. I think it makes a lot of sense to be using tabular-nums for those things. But that's a really important place to consider alignment overall, right, is these tables, right? And when it comes to those tables, we also expect that the value underneath and its alignment matches the heading on top, right? So the heading on top, if that's left aligned the heading. If the amount is right aligned in terms of the currency, then the label on top is also right aligned. That's the pattern that I've seen. I'm actually wondering now, because I actually didn't do the research on that, on something, and if you want to do research, that's great, about the patterns on that, because I've also seen people just center align the whole heading. And maybe it's something where if the headings are interactive that they should be centered, right? But especially in tables, I think tables are just, I feel like I could talk about tables for at least 2 hours on the show, which I'm not going to do. So maybe that's another show or maybe a blog post later on. But overall, that's a place where you would consider right alignment. I think it really is a matter of like talking about things like data that we're trying to convey, especially in comparisons. I think that's where right align could come into play. But generally speaking, you're going to avoid the right align stuff. One more thing that I wanted to, actually I wanted to bring up 2 more things, because one of those things that I wanted to bring up was other languages, which actually is in the other thing too. I found this post, which is typesetting, multilingual typesetting. And there's a lot of other things that they're talking about in terms of the multilingual stuff. But I saw this thing, which is talking about alignment. And languages have different rules when it comes to alignment. For example, Chinese text must be justified on both sides. And I looked at that and I was like, I don't think that's right. I mean, maybe it's right. It might be right. This is a Mike My question. If Mike, you're watching, or someone's watching this and knows Mike, to give some insight on this one. But again, we just talked about justified text and how those rivers end up happening. And in Chinese text that I've seen a ragged edge on one of the sides. I do know that when we were talking about aligning the characters themselves, the characters are monospace, and there's often even no space between the characters in many cases. So I'm curious to know where that came from. I wish there was a little bit of a citation in here, but there isn't. So, yeah, I was just a little surprised at that one. But I want to also show this thing. So this is from the Microsoft.com page about globalization, and they have this whole section about text alignment and pagination and things like that. And this is nice too because it talks about controlling orientation with HTML using CSS, right? So it talks about direction. We talked about that, left to right, right to left. We didn't actually talk about writing mode, and we're going to talk about that in the bottom a little bit, and also text orientation, which is a lot less common, but it is definitely happens in Asian languages a lot more often. We'll see some examples down here, right? So the first one here is the default, which is English. It's a left to right kind of language, and as we kind of know it. Then you have this example of Hebrew, which is right to left, right? But it's a similar kind of alignment where the starting edge of where you start reading is over here, right? But it's just on the right. Now, here's where things get a little interesting, okay? In traditional Chinese, in this example, what we have, and you can even see the cursor actually changes to vertical, right? What's actually happening is the first word of this sentence is actually here. This is the first word, okay? Or I guess this might be a word or a phenom or whatever, but it's the first character. So the first character is, it's not this one over here. This is the first character over here, okay? So what you could think of this as is effectively taking the English example and turning it kind of like 90 degrees, downward. I guess that's negative 90. Turning it downward and having it typed out this way, right? So it's a little bit, just that turn there is actually really interesting in terms of like, the writing mode, because the writing mode here, it actually says vertical RL, which means right to left, right? Which is effectively what's actually happening with each line. So each line is actually being read right to left. So you start with this line, this first one, then you go with the next one, and then the next one, the next one. You can even see the period that's over here. This is the end stop. That's at the last part here of the sentence. So this is actually being read in Chinese, right to left, it's just moving down. Now, here's this last one here, which you're like, okay, well, what's the difference, right? Well, the difference is that this is Mongolian, this is traditional classic Mongolian, where each one of these lines is actually being read left to right. But the left to right is actually going and reading down. So this here, let's try to select this one now. Come here. This is the first word of the sentence, okay? So now, this is probably a little bit closer to the RTL that's here and rotating that down, right? Rotating that 90 degrees, right? Because this is the first word over here, this one over here, right? So it's the first one, and then it's going down to the right. Yeah, so I think it's interesting because this is called right to left, and this is called left to right. But really, it's saying how the person is going to be reading this stuff across. Now, the important thing, we were talking about text alignment earlier in those examples, in our examples, but in these examples, we're not necessarily talking about the reading order of these lines. We were earlier talking about the alignment, right? And in all these examples, there is a starting edge, right? In the Hebrew example, the starting edge is the right edge, right? In the Chinese example that we just saw here, the starting edge is actually the top edge, and so is for the Mongolian, top edge, right? So that's the start of the alignment here. And you can see, we'll go back over here, there's a ragged edge down here, right? There's a ragged edge, okay, in the Chinese, and there's definitely a ragged edge here in the Mongolian, okay? So again, when it came to that earlier thing about the Chinese one being justified, I would have expected, some justification in there. Unless they mean that justify just means that you do get a ragged edge, it's only just a single character. So that's, but some things to consider. Again, if you are dealing with globalization, as Microsoft clearly is, definitely something you must consider in the grand scheme of stuff is that there's lots of different languages and the way that they're supposed to be aligned in different contexts. And, when we're talking about even just the tables, like what does a data point in a table look like under China, right? What does it look like for other languages, right to lefts? Are those left aligned? Probably, right? Admittedly, in Mongolian, I don't think it changes much because they're just data points and they're just numbers. So probably not the same, I think, or not much to change. I mean, in fact, I actually happen to know a lot about Mongolian, unfortunately. In fact, I pulled out something that's going to make me an ultra nerd. Here it is. Do you see this? Hopefully you're watching the video because I have a huge book in my hand. You see this book here? This book, I don't know if you could read that. It's a Mongolian English dictionary. It's the Lessing, or Lessing. Is it Lessing? Lessing. I got this, oh God, probably 15 years ago, probably a little longer. It cost over $200 at the time. And it is the most comprehensive Mongolian English dictionary on the face of the planet. Why do I have it? Because I studied Mongolian for like 2 years as a hobby, just for fun. Mostly because of that script that you saw. The classical script is the only living vertical single stroke script that's around. There's other scripts that are single stroke, but it's like an Arabic thing, right? That's single stroke. But this is the only vertical one. And you're like, well, Chinese is just vertical too. That's not a single script. That's characters that are blocks of characters that are being done. Yeah, I just thought that was very unique. So I actually dove in and I learned a lot because there's a lot of like Latin stuff kind of in there, like there's declensions and conjugations and like all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I really do like languages as well. That's why I dive deep into globalization and internationalization, localization, all the Zations. All those things I really enjoy. But ultimately, these are all things that I would love people to consider when thinking about, should I justify the text or not, right? And if we just keep in mind that I should left align everything as much as possible and only keep other alignments in play for very specific, deliberate moments, right? Not just because it's a heading, or a header, I should say, right? Not just because it's a hero image and, yes, of course, we're going to go ahead and make the center aligned. Really pay attention to how that's going to affect readability and comprehension when you are deciding what the alignment's going to be, all right? And admittedly, the less that you customize, the easier it is to just implement, right? If the entire site is just left aligned, right, whatever you're working on, that's a lot more consistent from a design system perspective, but also from a user expectation perspective, right? A user knows where to go and meet up with the text and bodies and things like that. Can your buttons have center aligned text? Absolutely, right? But that's honestly, other than the table stuff we talked about, that's the only thing I would really consider centering align, unless I'm being a lot more, what's it called? Like Wireframe, right? The Wireframe site is a lot more stylized, right? The links here, those are center aligned as well. Oh, come back here, please. There it goes. Yeah, the links are center aligned as well, but this is all left aligned. All this body copy, left aligned. Labels, left aligned. Button itself, left aligned, right? I mean, technically, this would be right aligned over here, right? Whereas the design system's house, that's technically right aligned. I mean, not exactly when it comes to the actual composition. That's using a space between justified, content flexbox scenario. But sometimes you just want that balance, right? Sometimes it makes sense, and for that particular case, right, this is like auxiliary information in that footer. It's not really that important, but it's nice to know that, Wireframe is underneath the design system's house. But that's all I really want to talk about for text alignment. I can't believe I talked about it for nearly half hour, probably longer. But I'm passionate about this stuff, and I want people to make really good decisions when they're talking about design out there. And I think even a small thing like having intention behind the choice of your text alignment is going to make your experiences a lot better. But let me know what you think in the comments or on the Discord. If you have something that you want to bring up over there, that would be wonderful. Make sure that you play nice in those places, and I will see you next time. Bye.